Patricia Moore trusted him completely. Everyone did. Richard Holloway had been Salem's funeral director for 23 years. Kind voice, gentle demeanor, professional competence during the worst days of people's lives. When Patricia's husband died suddenly in November 1994, Richard guided her through every decision: casket selection, service arrangements, burial plot coordination. "You don't have to face this alone," he told her, his hand on her shoulder, his voice full of practiced sympathy. 3 days after her husband's funeral, Patricia returned to Riverside Memorial to finalize paperwork. She never left. Her car remained in the parking lot for 2 days before anyone noticed. 29 years later, renovation crews found her behind a hidden wall, preserved in formaldehyde, wearing the same black dress she'd worn to bury her husband. The man everyone trusted had been collecting bodies nobody would miss. James Patrick Moore died on November 9, 1994, at 11:47 p.m. at Salem Hospital. He was 37 years old, seemingly healthy, until the massive heart attack that took him before the ambulance even arrived at their suburban home. Patricia had called 911 at 11:23 p.m. after finding James collapsed in their living room, clutching his chest, unable to speak. She performed CPR following the dispatcher's instructions, her 8-year-old daughter Emma watching from the hallway in her pajamas, too frightened to cry. The paramedics worked on James for 18 minutes in the emergency room before a doctor Patricia had never met before came out to tell her that her husband was gone. Cardiac arrest, massive myocardial infarction, medical terms that meant Patricia's world had ended at 35 years old, that Emma would grow up without a father, that the future they had planned, the modest house they were saving for, the family vacations they had talked about, all of it was gone in the time it took a heart to stop beating. Patricia moved through the next 2 days in a fog of shock and logistics. There were phone calls to make, relatives to notify, arrangements that needed handling, even though she could barely remember her own name. Her sister Karen drove up from Eugene, took charge of Emma, fielded calls from James's co-workers at the lumber mill, but the funeral arrangements had to be Patricia's decisions. She was the widow. She was the one who had to choose how to say goodbye. On November 11th, Patricia walked into Riverside Memorial Funeral Home for the first time. The building stood on Commercial Street, a tasteful Victorian structure painted cream with dark green trim, established in 1947 according to the brass plaque beside the entrance. Patricia had driven past it hundreds of times without really seeing it, the way people ignore funeral homes until sudden need makes them impossible to avoid. Richard Holloway met her in the reception area, introducing himself with a warm handshake and an expression of such genuine sympathy that Patricia felt tears she had been holding back finally spill over. Richard was 50 years old in 1994, with silver hair combed neatly back, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of face that inspired immediate trust. He wore a dark suit, conservative tie, polished shoes. Everything about him communicated professionalism and compassion. "Mrs. Moore, I'm so deeply sorry for your loss," Richard said, his voice pitched low and soothing. "I know this is incredibly difficult. I want you to know that you're not alone in this process. I'm here to help you through every step, to handle the details so you can focus on grieving and supporting your daughter. Would you like to sit down? Can I get you some water or coffee?" Patricia followed Richard to his office, a wood-paneled room with soft lighting, comfortable chairs, and framed certificates on the walls testifying to Richard's credentials and memberships in various professional organizations. He offered her tissues from a box that seemed positioned for exactly this purpose. He waited patiently while she composed herself. Then he began the process of helping her plan her husband's funeral. If you're new to revealed crime cases, this isn't fiction. This is the true story of how a trusted funeral director exploited grieving widows at their most vulnerable moment, and how a hidden room behind an embalming chamber kept terrible secrets for nearly 3 decades until renovation crews accidentally discovered what Richard Holloway had been doing to women nobody would immediately miss. Before we continue, take a second to hit that subscribe button. This channel explores America's most perplexing true crime cases, and I promise you, what happened at Riverside Memorial Funeral Home, and how formaldehyde chemistry finally exposed the truth will demonstrate that sometimes the people society trusts most with death are the ones we should fear. Richard made the process as painless as possible. He explained options without overwhelming Patricia. He showed her caskets ranging from simple pine to elaborate mahogany, but never pressured her toward expensive choices. When she selected a mid-range casket with brass handles and cream interior, Richard nodded approvingly. James would have appreciated the dignity without ostentation, he said, though he had never met James, had no way of knowing what James would have wanted, but it was exactly what Patricia needed to hear. They discussed the service. Would it be at a church or at the funeral home's chapel? Patricia chose the funeral home, unable to face the church where she and James had been married, where Emma had been baptized. Richard assured her the chapel could accommodate up to 100 guests. They selected music, decided on an open casket, despite Patricia's hesitation. It helps with closure, Richard explained gently. Seeing him at peace, having that final moment, it's important for the healing process. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, Patricia felt grateful for Richard's guidance, for his patience, for the way he had taken something overwhelming and made it manageable. As she prepared to leave, Richard walked her to the door, his hand briefly touching her elbow, in a gesture that seemed protective rather than inappropriate. "Patricia, if I may call you that, I want you to know that you can call me any time, day or night, if you have questions or concerns. This is what I do. This is how I serve families in our community. You're not a burden. You're someone going through one of life's most difficult experiences, and I'm honored to help carry that weight with you." Patricia thanked him, her voice thick with emotion. She left Riverside Memorial feeling, despite everything, that she had found someone she could trust during this nightmare. The funeral took place on November 15th, 1994, a Tuesday. The weather was typical for Oregon in November, overcast and drizzling, the kind of persistent rain that Willamette Valley residents barely noticed, but that Patricia would forever associate with saying goodbye to James. Over 70 people attended, co-workers from the lumber mill, neighbors, friends from Emma's elementary school. Patricia sat in the front row with Emma beside her, Karen on her other side, trying to process the reality that her husband was in the casket Richard had helped her select. Richard conducted the service with practiced professionalism. He spoke briefly about the importance of remembering James, about supporting Patricia and Emma, about the community coming together in grief. His words were appropriate, comforting, delivered with the right balance of solemnity and hope. After the service, during the reception in the funeral home's gathering room, Richard moved among the guests, offering condolences, ensuring coffee was fresh and food was plentiful, his presence simultaneously visible and unobtrusive. Patricia noticed him watching her several times during the reception. When their eyes met, he offered a small, sympathetic smile. She interpreted it as professional concern, a funeral director ensuring his client was managing the difficult day. She didn't recognize it as something else, as assessment, as evaluation, as the predatory calculation of someone identifying vulnerability. The burial took place the following morning at Pioneer Cemetery on the outskirts of Salem. November 16th dawned cold and clear, the rain having passed overnight. Richard arrived early to coordinate with the cemetery staff, ensuring the gravesite was properly prepared, that the tent was positioned correctly, that chairs were arranged for family members. When Patricia arrived with Emma and Karen, everything was ready. The service was brief, just immediate family and a few close friends. Richard stood at a respectful distance, hands clasped in front of him, head bowed, the picture of respectful attendance. After James was lowered into the ground, after the final prayers were spoken, after Patricia placed a rose on the casket and led Emma away from the grave, Richard approached. "Patricia, everything from this point forward is paperwork and final details. There's no rush. When you're ready, perhaps in a few days, come by the funeral home and we'll handle the death certificates, the invoices, all the administrative matters. Take your time. Grieve with your daughter. I'll be here whenever you're ready." Patricia nodded, grateful for his understanding. She spent the next 2 days in a haze, accepting casseroles from neighbors, answering Emma's impossible questions about where Daddy was and why he couldn't come home, trying to figure out how to continue existing in a world that had fundamentally changed. On November 18th, a Friday, Patricia decided to handle the funeral home paperwork. Karen had returned to Eugene the previous day, needing to get back to her own family and job. Emma was at school. Patricia was alone in the house that felt too quiet, too empty. Dealing with administrative details seemed preferable to sitting in silence. She called Riverside Memorial at 2:30 p.m., asking if Richard was available. His receptionist, a pleasant woman named Diane, said Richard would be happy to see her any time that afternoon. Patricia arrived at the funeral home at 3:15 p.m., parking her blue Toyota Camry in the small lot beside the building. The lot was empty, except for Richard's black Cadillac and what she assumed was Diane's car. She walked through the front entrance, the bell above the door chiming softly to announce her arrival. Diane greeted her warmly, expressed condolences again, and led her to Richard's office. Richard rose from his desk as Patricia entered, his face arranging itself into an expression of gentle concern. "Patricia, how are you holding up? Please, sit down. Can I get you anything? Water? Coffee?" Patricia declined, taking the seat across from his desk. "I just want to handle the paperwork and settle the invoice," she said. "I need to start moving forward, you know? I can't just sit at home anymore." Richard nodded understandingly. "Of course. Let's take care of everything today. Put this part behind you so you can focus on healing." He pulled a manila folder from his desk drawer, opened it to reveal several forms requiring signatures, copies of the death certificate, and an itemized invoice showing the funeral costs totaling $6,147. They went through each document. Patricia signed where Richard indicated, her signature shaky but legible. She wrote a check for the full amount, her hand trembling slightly as she tore it from the checkbook. Richard accepted it, filed everything neatly, then stood and extended his hand. "You've been remarkably strong through all of this, Patricia. Emma is lucky to have such a resilient mother." As Patricia rose to leave, Richard checked his watch. "It's just after 3:45. Are you heading home now? I hope you have plans for the evening, people to be with. You shouldn't be alone." Patricia admitted she was planning to pick Emma up from school at 3, but had gotten the time confused that she needed to run a few errands before heading home. Richard walked her to the reception area, where Diane was shutting down her computer, preparing to leave for the day. "Have a good weekend, Diane," Richard said. Diane gathered her purse, offered Patricia another expression of sympathy, and left through the front door. The building was quiet now, just Patricia and Richard in the tastefully appointed funeral home. "Let me walk you to your car," Richard offered. Patricia noticed his expression had changed somehow, the professional sympathy replaced by something else, something she couldn't quite identify. Before she could respond, before she could say she could manage alone, Richard's hand was on her elbow, guiding her not toward the front door, but toward a hallway she hadn't noticed during her previous visits, a corridor leading to the back of the building, to the parts of the funeral home families didn't see, to the embalming room where death was prepared for viewing. Patricia's car would be found in the Riverside Memorial parking lot on Sunday morning, November 20th, when a neighbor driving by noticed it had been there for 2 days. Inside the car, police would find Patricia's purse on the passenger seat, her wallet containing $43 and all her credit cards, her keys in the ignition. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened to the widow who had come to finalize her husband's funeral arrangements and simply vanished. Karen Sullivan received the call on Sunday morning, November 20th at 9:47 a.m. It was Salem Police Department asking if she had heard from her sister Patricia in the past 48 hours. Karen's immediate response was confusion, followed by rising panic. Patricia had been planning a quiet weekend at home with Emma. Why was the police calling? The officer explained that Patricia's vehicle had been found in the parking lot of Riverside Memorial Funeral Home, apparently abandoned for at least 2 days. Patricia was missing. Karen made the 90-minute drive from Eugene in just over an hour, breaking every speed limit, her mind racing through possibilities. Patricia wouldn't just leave Emma. She wouldn't disappear without telling anyone. Something had happened, something terrible. When Karen arrived at the Salem Police Department, she was directed to Detective Sharon Martinez, a 15-year veteran of the force who specialized in missing persons cases. Detective Martinez was 42 in 1994, a methodical investigator who had learned through experience that the first 48 hours of a missing person case were critical. Patricia Moore had already been missing for at least that long, possibly longer. Martinez sat Karen down in an interview room and began establishing a timeline. When had Karen last spoken to Patricia? What had Patricia's state of mind been? Were there any indications she might harm herself or simply walk away from her life? Patricia would never leave Emma, Karen insisted, her voice firm despite the tears on her cheeks. She was devastated about James, but she was holding it together for her daughter. She's a good mother. She wouldn't abandon her child. Martinez took detailed notes. Patricia was 35, Caucasian, 5 feet 6 inches tall, approximately 130 pounds, dark brown hair, shoulder-length brown eyes. Last seen wearing black pants, a gray sweater, and a black coat, the mourning clothes she had worn throughout the funeral process. She had been driving a 1992 blue Toyota Camry, license plate number Oregon 847 DJK, now sitting in evidence impound. The investigation began at Riverside Memorial Funeral Home. Martinez arrived at the Victorian building on Sunday afternoon with her partner, Detective Frank Chen. They found Richard Holloway in his office, working despite it being Sunday. He expressed immediate concern when Martinez explained why they were there. Patricia was here Friday afternoon, Richard said, his face showing appropriate worry. She came to finalize paperwork, settle the invoice for her husband's funeral. We finished everything around 3:45 p.m. She mentioned needing to run errands before picking up her daughter from school. I walked her to the reception area, and she left. I assumed she went home. Are you saying she never made it home? Martinez asked Richard to walk them through the afternoon in detail. Richard explained that his receptionist Diane had left at approximately 3:40 p.m., that Patricia had arrived around 3:15 p.m., that the meeting had been routine and unremarkable. She seemed composed, Richard said. Grief was evident, of course, but she was handling things well. She signed the necessary documents, wrote a check for the funeral costs, thanked me for my help. When she left, she walked to her car. I saw her through the window. She got in her car and drove away. You saw her drive away? Martinez asked, making note of this detail. Well, I saw her car leave the parking lot, Richard clarified. I didn't stand at the window watching, but I heard her car start, and when I glanced outside a moment later, her car was gone. I assumed she had left. Martinez examined the parking lot, the route from the building to where Patricia's car had been found. The vehicle was parked in the exact spot Richard said Patricia had used on Friday. It was locked, keys in the ignition, purse on the passenger seat, no signs of struggle, no blood, nothing to indicate violence had occurred. It appeared Patricia had simply parked, locked her car, and walked away, leaving everything behind. But that made no sense. If Patricia had left voluntarily, why would she leave her purse with her wallet and identification? Why would she leave her keys in the ignition? Where would she go without money or transportation? And most importantly, why would she abandon her daughter? The receptionist, Diane Morrison, was interviewed on Monday morning. She confirmed Richard's timeline. Patricia had arrived at 3:15 p.m., had been in Richard's office for approximately 30 minutes. Diane had left at 3:40 p.m., as she always did on Fridays, beginning her weekend. When she left, Patricia was still in Richard's office. Diane had called out goodbye, and Richard had responded, but Diane hadn't spoken to Patricia directly. She confirmed that Patricia's car was in the parking lot when she left. Did you see Patricia leave? Martinez asked. Diane shook her head. I left before her meeting with Richard finished. I assumed she left shortly after, but I didn't see her walk out or drive away. Search efforts began on Monday, November 21st. Over 100 volunteers combed through Salem's parks, searched along the Willamette River, checked abandoned buildings and wooded areas. Patricia's photograph was distributed to local media. The story ran on the evening news. Local widow missing after visiting funeral home. Community members who had attended James Moore's funeral expressed shock and concern. Some remembered Patricia from the service, remembered thinking how tragic it was for someone so young to lose a spouse, how difficult it must be raising a daughter alone. Richard Holloway joined the search efforts, spending Tuesday walking through Minto Brown Island Park with other volunteers, calling Patricia's name, checking trails and picnic areas. When interviewed by a local news crew, Richard expressed deep concern for Patricia's well-being. She was dealing with tremendous grief, he told the reporter. Losing a spouse so suddenly, at such a young age, the psychological impact can be overwhelming. I'm praying we find her safe. Her daughter needs her mother. Detective Martinez watched the news clip in her office that evening, studying Richard's body language, his choice of words. Something about his performance, and that's what it felt like to Martinez, a performance, troubled her. Richard showed appropriate concern, but not genuine distress. He maintained perfect composure while discussing a woman who had vanished from his establishment. Most people, when connected even peripherally to a missing person case, showed nervousness or anxiety. Richard showed neither. On Wednesday, Martinez returned to Riverside Memorial with a search warrant. She and her team spent 8 hours examining the building, looking for any evidence that Patricia Moore had met with foul play on the premises. They examined Richard's office, the reception area, the chapel, the embalming room, every space Patricia might have entered. They found nothing. No blood evidence, no signs of struggle, no indication that anything criminal had occurred. The embalming room was exactly what Martinez expected. Clinical, sterile, equipped with the tools of Richard's profession. Embalming table, drainage system, chemicals stored properly, everything documented and licensed. It was unsettling in the way funeral home preparation areas always are, but not suspicious. Martinez noted that Richard had cooperated fully with the search, had provided access to every area without hesitation, had answered every question without apparent evasiveness. "What do you think happened to her?" Martinez asked Richard during a break in the search. They were standing in the parking lot, watching technicians examine the spot where Patricia's car had been found. Richard removed his glasses, cleaned them with a handkerchief, and shook his head sadly. "I honestly don't know, Detective. I've worked with hundreds of grieving families over the years. Most people, they're resilient. They suffer, but they survive. But occasionally, someone's pain is simply too much. Patricia had lost her husband suddenly, had a young daughter to care for, probably had financial concerns about the future. That's an enormous burden. I hope I'm wrong, but I fear she may have harmed herself. Perhaps she's somewhere we haven't searched yet. Perhaps she wanted to escape and made impulsive decisions. I just don't know." The theory of suicide or voluntary disappearance didn't sit right with Martinez. Patricia's purse being left behind argued against planning. The lack of any goodbye note or communication with her daughter argued against intentional departure. And Karen's insistence that Patricia would never abandon Emma carried weight. But without evidence of foul play, without a body, without witnesses, the investigation was stalling. Financial records showed Patricia had no unusual transactions after Friday afternoon. Her bank account remained untouched. Her credit cards were never used again. Phone records showed her last call was to Riverside Memorial on Friday at 2:30 p.m., arranging her appointment with Richard. She had made no other calls that day. Her home phone showed no incoming calls on Friday evening or throughout the weekend. Emma Moore, 8 years old and now effectively orphaned, moved in with her Aunt Karen. The child was interviewed by a specially trained child psychologist, but Emma had no information about her mother's disappearance. She had been at school when Patricia went to the funeral home, had been picked up by Karen when Patricia failed to arrive. Emma's last memory of her mother was saying goodbye that morning, Patricia kissing her forehead and promising they would have pizza for dinner. By December, the active search efforts had ended. Patricia's case remained open, but without new leads, investigators had nowhere to turn. Detective Martinez continued following up on tips, investigating reported sightings that inevitably led nowhere. A woman matching Patricia's description was seen in Portland, in Eugene, in Bend. None of the sightings were confirmed. Patricia Moore had simply vanished. The case was featured on a local television program about unsolved disappearances in March 1995. The segment included interviews with Karen, with Detective Martinez, and with Richard Holloway. Richard spoke movingly about the tragedy of Patricia's disappearance, about his hope that she would be found alive, about his commitment to supporting families through their darkest moments, despite the pain of not knowing what had happened to someone he had tried to help. "I think about Patricia often," Richard told the camera. "I wonder if there was something I could have said or done that would have made a difference. This profession, we see grief every day, but when someone we've tried to help simply vanishes, it stays with you. I pray for her daughter, I pray for answers, and I hope that wherever Patricia is, she's found some peace." By summer 1995, Patricia Moore's case was officially classified as cold. The investigation remained technically active, but with no new leads and no evidence, there was nowhere for investigators to go. Detective Martinez kept the file on her desk for another year before finally boxing it up and moving it to the cold case storage. She retired in 2008, and Patricia's case was among the handful that haunted her, the ones she wished she could have solved, the ones where instinct said something was wrong, but evidence refused to speak. Emma Moore grew up with her Aunt Karen, visiting her father's grave regularly, holding out hope that someday her mother would return or that someone would finally explain where she had gone. She graduated from high school in 2004, attended community college, became a nurse, married, had children of her own. But she never stopped wondering what happened to her mother that November Friday in 1994, never stopped hoping that someday she would have answers instead of the silence that had defined her childhood and adult life. Richard Holloway continued operating Riverside Memorial Funeral Home for another 24 years after Patricia Moore disappeared. Throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s, he remained Salem's most respected funeral director, the man families called during their darkest hours, the professional who guided them through grief with practiced compassion. He served on the board of the Oregon Funeral Directors Association, mentored younger professionals entering the death care industry, and donated generously to local charities. Nobody questioned his integrity. Nobody connected him to Patricia Moore's unsolved disappearance except Detective Martinez, who had long since retired with her suspicions unconfirmed. The funeral business evolved through the decades, but Richard adapted seamlessly. He computerized his record-keeping in 1998, established an online presence in 2003, offered cremation services when that became more common in the 2010s. Riverside Memorial maintained its reputation for dignified, personalized service, the kind of establishment that families recommended to friends facing loss. Richard's waiting room remained furnished with comfortable chairs and soft lighting. His office still displayed professional certificates and sympathetic artwork, and his manner with grieving families never wavered from the perfect balance of compassion and competence. What nobody knew, what couldn't be known without access to areas of the funeral home that visitors never saw, was what existed behind the embalming chamber. The hidden room remained sealed, its entrance invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. The blueprints Richard had filed with the city in 1994 showed no such space. The original 1947 blueprints, buried in city archives, showed a storage closet that officially no longer existed. Richard had modified the building carefully, sealing off the room, removing it from records, creating a space that existed only in his private knowledge. Patricia Moore was not the first person Richard Holloway had hidden in that room, though she would be the last. The pattern had started earlier, in the 1980s, with women whose circumstances made them vulnerable and whose disappearances would generate investigation but not immediate suspicion. Women who were isolated, recently bereaved, without strong family networks. Women who came to Riverside Memorial at their most vulnerable, seeking help with the dead, never imagining they would join them. Over the years, cold case detectives reviewing unsolved disappearances in the Salem area occasionally noticed patterns that troubled them. In 1989, a widow named Margaret Chen had disappeared 3 days after her husband's funeral. In 1992, Dorothy Kramer, whose teenage son had died in a car accident, vanished shortly after the memorial service. In 1997, Linda Vasquez, who had buried her mother, was reported missing by distant relatives who hadn't heard from her in weeks. Each case had been investigated, but none had been solved. Each woman had used Riverside Memorial. Each had last been seen in the vicinity of the funeral home. In 2004, Detective Raymond Walters was assigned to review these cold cases, looking for connections. He noticed the Riverside Memorial link, interviewed Richard Holloway, and came away with the same impression others had. Richard was cooperative, professional, appropriately concerned. Yes, it was tragic that several families he had served had later experienced additional tragedies with missing relatives. Yes, it seemed like a disturbing coincidence. But grief made people unpredictable. Sometimes the weight of loss drove people to desperate actions. Richard had provided that exact explanation to multiple investigators over multiple years, and without evidence of foul play, without bodies, without witnesses, there was nothing to pursue. So here's something I'd like to know. What's the weather like where you're watching from today? Our story takes place in Oregon, where persistent November rain sets the mood for tragedy, and where funeral homes provide necessary shelter from storms, both literal and emotional. Weather creates atmosphere in true crime stories, and I'm always curious where our viewers are experiencing these cases from, whether you're watching in sunshine or storm. Drop your location and weather in the comments. It helps me understand how this community connects across different places, all drawn to these stories of justice delayed but eventually delivered. Richard Holloway's personal life remained as opaque as his professional life was visible. He had never married, lived alone in a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, maintained few close friendships. Former colleagues described him as private but pleasant, someone who kept work and personal life carefully separated. Richard was always professional, said Margaret Simmons, who worked as his assistant from 1995 to 2003. He was kind to families, patient with employees, meticulous about every detail. But you never really knew him, you know. He didn't talk about himself. He didn't share personal information. After 8 years working with him, I realized I knew almost nothing about who Richard was outside of work. This emotional distance, which might have seemed suspicious in other contexts, was unremarkable in a funeral director. The profession required boundaries, the ability to provide compassion without becoming emotionally entangled, to support grieving families while maintaining professional detachment. Richard's reserve was interpreted as appropriate professional behavior rather than a red flag for something darker. By 2015, Richard was 71 years old and beginning to consider retirement. His health was declining, arthritis making the physical aspects of funeral work difficult, his vision deteriorating despite updated prescriptions. He hired Jonathan Reeves, a younger funeral director from Portland, to assist with operations, gradually transferring responsibilities while maintaining ownership. For 3 years, they worked together, Jonathan handling most client interactions while Richard managed administrative duties and provided mentorship. In 2018, Richard finally retired, selling Riverside Memorial to Jonathan Reeves in a transaction that included the building, equipment, client records, and established reputation. Richard had operated the funeral home for 44 years, serving over 3,000 families, becoming a fixture of Salem's death care community. His retirement was marked by a small gathering attended by former colleagues and grateful families who credited Richard with helping them through impossible times. He accepted their thanks with characteristic humility, declined suggestions of a larger celebration, and quietly withdrew from the profession that had defined his adult life. Jonathan Reeves operated Riverside Memorial for 4 years, maintaining Richard's standards and reputation. But the funeral industry was changing. Larger corporations were buying independent funeral homes, offering services at lower costs, making it difficult for small establishments to compete. By 2022, after struggling with declining business and increasing overhead, Jonathan made the difficult decision to close Riverside Memorial. The building was sold to a medical group planning to convert it into urgent care offices. In August 2022, the final funeral was conducted at Riverside Memorial, and the doors closed on 75 years of Salem history. Richard Holloway died on April 3, 2021, at age 77, in a nursing care facility where he had spent his final 18 months after a stroke left him partially paralyzed. He died alone, no family at his bedside, attended only by staff who knew him as a quiet resident who rarely received visitors and never spoke about his past. His obituary in the Salem Statesman Journal was brief. Richard Holloway, retired funeral director, passed away April 3 at age 77. Mr. Holloway operated Riverside Memorial Funeral Home from 1974 to 2018, serving the Salem community with dignity and compassion. No services will be held at his request. Donations may be made to the Oregon Funeral Directors Association Scholarship Fund. The obituary generated a handful of comments from people he had served, expressing gratitude for his help during difficult times. Nobody mentioned Patricia Moore. By 2021, her disappearance was 27 years in the past, a cold case that most people in Salem had forgotten if they had ever known about it at all. Emma Moore, now 35 years old, the same age her mother had been when she vanished, saw Richard's obituary and felt nothing but a vague unease she couldn't articulate. She remembered him from her childhood, the funeral director who had handled her father's funeral, the man who had last seen her mother. But she had been 8 years old then, and her memories were fragmentary, distorted by trauma and time. What Emma didn't know, what nobody knew in April 2021, was that Richard's death had started a clock ticking. His estate, modest but carefully organized, was handled by an attorney who had never met Richard personally. The few personal possessions Richard had kept were donated or discarded. His financial records showed decades of careful accounting, legitimate business operations, nothing suspicious. The attorney found no family to notify, no friends to contact. Richard Holloway passed from life without leaving ripples, his secrets seemingly dying with him. But secrets have a way of surviving their keepers. Richard had maintained control of his hidden room as long as he lived, had visited it occasionally even after retirement, checking the seals, ensuring the space remained undiscovered. But once he was gone, once Riverside Memorial changed hands and then closed entirely, the building became just another piece of real estate awaiting redevelopment. And redevelopment meant demolition, renovation, structural changes that would disturb walls that had stood untouched for decades. Throughout 2022 and early 2023, the former Riverside Memorial building sat empty, waiting for permits and financing. Neighbors watched it deteriorate slightly, paint peeling, landscaping overgrown, the funeral home's dignified Victorian appearance fading without maintenance. Children walked past it on the way to school, occasionally daring each other to peer through windows into the dim interior where caskets had once been displayed and grieving families had once gathered. In October 2023, construction crews finally arrived. The building was to be gutted and renovated, transformed from death care facility to medical offices. The exterior Victorian charm would be preserved, but the interior would be completely reconfigured. New walls, new plumbing, new electrical, new HVAC systems. Everything that made the building a funeral home would be stripped away, replaced with examination rooms and waiting areas designed for the living rather than the dead. The construction foreman, Michael Torres, had worked dozens of renovation projects, but had never previously worked on a former funeral home. His crew approached the job with a mixture of professionalism and unease. There was something unsettling about demolishing a space where so many people had said goodbye to loved ones, about tearing down walls that had absorbed decades of grief. "It's just a building," Torres told his crew. "Don't let your imagination run wild." The demolition started in the public areas, reception, chapels, viewing rooms. These spaces yielded nothing unexpected, just standard commercial construction. But when the crew reached the back of the building, the areas that had been off-limits to families, they encountered the embalming chamber. The room was as clinical as expected, tiled walls and floors designed for easy cleaning, industrial sinks, specialized lighting. The crew worked carefully, aware that funeral home embalming rooms often contained chemicals and equipment requiring careful disposal. On November 7, 2023, almost exactly 29 years to the day after Patricia Moore disappeared, Torres's crew began demolishing the embalming chamber's walls. The plan was to open up the space, combine it with adjacent areas to create larger rooms for the medical practice. A worker named David Hernandez swung a sledgehammer at the east wall, expecting solid concrete behind the tile. Instead, the sledgehammer broke through into hollow space. "Hey, Mike," David called to Torres. "There's something weird here. This wall's hollow." Torres came over, examined the breach David had created. He shined his flashlight through the hole, and the beam illuminated a space that shouldn't exist. A room, approximately 8 feet by 10 feet, sealed off from the rest of the building. And in that room, clearly visible in the flashlight's beam, was furniture. A table, shelves, and in the center, unmistakable even from a distance, a casket. Torres pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "This is Michael Torres, foreman at the construction site on Commercial Street, the old funeral home. You need to send police immediately. We just found a hidden room and there's a casket inside. I think there might be a body." Salem Police Department received Torres's call at 2:47 p.m. on November 7, 2023. Within 15 minutes, patrol officers had secured the construction site, established a perimeter, and contacted the detective division. By 3:30 p.m., Detective James Rivera, who led the department's major crimes unit, arrived with a forensic team. Rivera was 38, 8 years into detective work, and had never investigated anything quite like what Torres was describing. "You found a hidden room with a casket inside a former funeral home?" Rivera asked Torres, wanting to confirm he understood correctly. Torres nodded, leading Rivera through the construction site to the embalming chamber where the breach in the wall remained exactly as David Hernandez had left it. Rivera shined his own flashlight through the opening, and his stomach tightened at what he saw. The room beyond the wall was small, windowless, sealed off from any natural light. The air that escaped through the breach carried a distinctive smell, not decomposition, but chemicals, sweet and cloying. Formaldehyde. Rivera recognized it from his training, the preservative used in embalming. The flashlight beam revealed a space that looked less like storage and more like a shrine. The casket sat centered on a small platform. Shelves along one wall held personal items arranged with disturbing care. A black purse, a pair of women's shoes, photographs in frames, and on a small table, visible even through the narrow opening, papers that appeared to be documents. "Nobody enters this room," Rivera ordered, backing away from the wall. "This is a crime scene. We process it properly, document everything before anyone goes inside." He called for additional forensic technicians, for lighting equipment, for the medical examiner's office. The construction site, which had been full of workers and noise 30 minutes earlier, fell silent except for police radios and the arrival of additional personnel. Sarah Brennan, Polk County Medical Examiner, arrived at 4:45 p.m. She had held the position for 6 years and had worked hundreds of death investigations, but this was unprecedented. A sealed room containing a casket in a former funeral home, hidden for decades, discovered by accident during renovation. "We need to open this wall carefully," Dr. Brennan told Rivera. "Preserve the scene while creating access. Whatever's in that room has been sealed for years, possibly decades. We treat this like an archaeological site." The forensic team spent the next 2 hours carefully removing tile and drywall, creating an opening large enough for personnel to enter while documenting every stage of the process. Photographers captured the wall structure, the hidden entrance, the way someone had sealed this space and removed it from building plans. Finally, at 6:52 p.m., with portable lights illuminating the hidden room, Dr. Brennan and Detective Rivera entered the space that Richard Holloway had created and Patricia Moore had never left. The room's interior stopped both investigators in their tracks. It was not the chaotic dump site of a panicked killer. It was organized, almost reverent, the arrangement of someone who had created a private memorial. The casket dominated the center of the room, mahogany with brass handles, the same style Patricia Moore had selected for her husband's burial. The lid was closed but not sealed. Shelves along one wall held items arranged like museum displays. A black purse, a wallet open to show a driver's license with Patricia Moore's photograph and information, a set of car keys with a Toyota emblem, women's shoes size 7, a coat folded neatly. On the small table sat papers that Dr. Brennan photographed before touching. The top document was a funeral home invoice made out to Patricia Moore, dated November 18, 1994, itemizing charges for James Moore's funeral. Beneath it was a death certificate for James Patrick Moore. And beneath that were photographs, family photos showing Patricia with her husband and daughter, images that must have been taken from her purse after she disappeared. "This is a shrine," Rivera said quietly. "Whoever did this kept her belongings, displayed them like artifacts. This wasn't just about hiding a body. This was about possession." Dr. Brennan approached the casket with gloved hands. The lid opened smoothly, and the contents confirmed what they had feared and expected. Inside lay a woman's body, perfectly preserved through embalming, appearing as if she had died days rather than decades ago. She wore a black dress, her hands folded across her chest, her dark hair still holding its style. The formaldehyde preservation had prevented natural decomposition, freezing her in time, creating the grotesque illusion that she was sleeping rather than dead for 29 years. "This is professional embalming," Dr. Brennan observed, "performed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The preservation is remarkable. We'll need to confirm identity through dental records or DNA, but based on the belongings and the documentation, I believe this is Patricia Moore, missing since November 1994. The crime scene processing continued through the night. Every item in the room was photographed in place, measured, documented before being collected as evidence. The forensic team noted that the room's construction showed deliberate planning. The entrance had been concealed behind the embalming chamber's tile wall, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. The space was ventilated through a system that prevented chemical smells from seeping into other areas of the building. Whoever created this room had architectural knowledge and funeral industry expertise. The building's blueprints became crucial evidence. Detectives obtained copies of multiple versions filed with Salem's building department over the decades. The original 1947 plans showed a storage closet in the location where the hidden room was discovered. Blueprints from a 1993 renovation filed by Richard Holloway showed the space had been removed to expand embalming chamber. But the actual construction hadn't removed the space. It had sealed it off, creating a hidden room that existed physically but not on any official records. Richard Holloway owned this funeral home from 1974 until 2018, Rivera told his team during a briefing at 11 p.m. He filed these modified blueprints in 1993, 1 year before Patricia Moore disappeared. He was planning this before he even selected his victim. This wasn't impulsive. This was premeditated, calculated murder combined with a trophy collection. The forensic analysis of the room's contents provided additional evidence. The formaldehyde used to preserve Patricia's body was tested for chemical composition and manufacturer signatures. Modern forensic chemistry could identify not just the type of embalming fluid, but the specific batch, trace it to purchase records, establish when and where it was acquired. The samples taken from Patricia's remains matched formaldehyde formulations used in the mid-1990s, and more specifically, matched batches purchased by Riverside Memorial Funeral Home in October 1994, 1 month before Patricia disappeared. "This proves Richard Holloway embalmed Patricia Moore," Dr. Brennan explained to Rivera. "The chemical signature is unique to his funeral home, to supplies he ordered before she vanished. He didn't just kill her, he prepared to preserve her. The embalming supplies were purchased before she disappeared, meaning he was planning this. She wasn't a crime of opportunity. She was selected, targeted, and murdered according to a plan he had developed in advance." On November 8th, Detective Rivera made the phone call he had been dreading. Karen Sullivan, Patricia's sister, was now 63 years old, still living in Eugene, still maintaining the faint hope that someday her sister would be found. Rivera told her as gently as possible that Patricia had been located, that she'd been murdered in 1994 and her body hidden in the funeral home, that Richard Holloway, who had died 2 years earlier, was the only suspect. Karen's reaction was shock, followed by a grief that felt fresh despite nearly 3 decades having passed. "She was there the whole time?" Karen asked, her voice breaking. "In that building. We searched for her. We put up posters. We never stopped hoping. And she was there, 30 feet from where we stood when we talked to him, when he told us he hoped we'd find her." The worst call was to Emma Moore. She was 37 now, the same age her mother had been when she died, living in Portland with her husband and 2 children. Detective Rivera drove to Portland to deliver the news in person rather than over the phone. Emma sat in her living room, listening as Rivera explained what had been found, watching as her understanding of her entire life shifted. "My mother was murdered by the funeral director," Emma said, repeating the information as if saying it aloud might make it make sense. "The man who buried my father killed my mother 3 days later, and I've spent 29 years wondering where she was, imagining she might still be alive somewhere, and she was in that building the entire time." Rivera confirmed everything, his voice gentle. Emma asked the question that countless victims' families ask. Why? Why would he do that? Rivera could only speculate. Patricia was vulnerable, recently widowed, isolated. Richard had access and opportunity. The hidden room suggested this was a pattern, that Patricia might not have been his only victim. Emma's grief was overwhelming, but beneath it was something else, something that would take time to fully surface. Relief. After 29 years, she finally had answers. Terrible answers, but answers nonetheless. If this case has affected you, if it reminds you that truth can surface even when perpetrators die believing their secrets are safe, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing attention to cold cases like Patricia's, cases where families waited decades for answers that modern forensic science and accidental discoveries finally provided. Share this video with someone who appreciates how chemistry, careful documentation, and a construction crew's sledgehammer can combine to expose evil that hid for nearly 3 decades. Leave a comment about what aspect of this investigation resonated with you most. Building this community creates awareness that matters for families still waiting for truth. The investigation expanded to examine whether Patricia was Richard Holloway's only victim. Cold case detectives pulled files on the other missing women connected to Riverside Memorial: Margaret Chen in 1989, Dorothy Kramer in 1992, Linda Vasquez in 1997. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed at the former funeral home site, searching for anomalies that might indicate additional hidden spaces or burial sites. The search found nothing. If Richard had killed others, he had disposed of them differently, or the evidence was beyond recovery. The formal identification of Patricia Moore's remains took 3 days. Dental records from her dentist in 1994 were compared to the preserved body found in the hidden room, and the match was conclusive. DNA analysis using samples provided by Emma and Karen confirmed with absolute certainty that the woman Richard Holloway had embalmed and hidden for 29 years was Patricia Moore, widow, mother, and the last person to trust him with her grief. The autopsy, complicated by decades of formaldehyde preservation, revealed additional truths about Patricia's final moments. Dr. Brennan discovered evidence of manual strangulation, the hyoid bone fractured in a pattern consistent with pressure applied from behind. Patricia had been killed quickly, efficiently, by someone who knew human anatomy. The embalming had occurred shortly after death, within hours based on the quality of preservation. Richard had murdered Patricia in his funeral home on November 18, 1994, likely in the embalming room itself, then immediately prepared her body using his professional skills to ensure she would remain indefinitely preserved in his hidden shrine. The investigation into Richard Holloway's background revealed a man who had hidden darkness behind professional competence for decades. Detectives obtained a warrant to search Richard's former residence, a modest house that had been sold after his death and was now occupied by a family who cooperated fully with the investigation. In the attic, packed in boxes the new owners hadn't yet explored, investigators found Richard's personal journals. The journals dated back to 1982 and continued sporadically through 2019, 2 years before Richard's death. They weren't confessions in the traditional sense, but they contained coded references and philosophical musings that took on sinister meaning in light of Patricia's discovery. Entries from late 1994 were particularly chilling. On November 19th, the day after Patricia disappeared, Richard had written, "Today I provided the ultimate service. She came to me in grief, and I have ensured she will never grieve again. Preservation is the highest calling of our profession. Most stop at temporary preparation for viewing. I understand the beauty of permanence." Throughout the journals, Richard referenced his fascination with preservation, with death as a state that could be frozen and maintained indefinitely. He wrote about his frustration with families who chose cremation, which he viewed as destruction rather than conservation. He detailed his modification of the funeral home in 1993, creating what he called his permanent viewing room, a space where he could maintain what he considered his finest work away from the temporary nature of burial. The journals revealed Richard's selection criteria for victims. He targeted women experiencing profound grief, women who were isolated or whose disappearances would generate investigation but not immediate family networks demanding answers. He wrote about studying obituaries, attending services, identifying widows or mothers who seemed particularly vulnerable. "Society fails to protect those in grief," he wrote in 1991. "They are invisible, their pain making others uncomfortable. I offer them peace, and I preserve them in the moment before grief would have destroyed their beauty." The coded references suggested Patricia might not have been Richard's only victim, but without bodies or additional hidden rooms, investigators couldn't confirm how many women Richard had killed. The missing persons cases of Margaret Chen, Dorothy Kramer, and Linda Vasquez remained unsolved, though investigators now strongly suspected Richard had been responsible for those disappearances as well. But without evidence, without remains, those cases would likely remain forever unresolved. The revelation of Richard Holloway's crimes sent shockwaves through Salem's community and the broader funeral industry. People who had trusted Richard with their most painful moments, who had relied on his guidance during grief, now faced the horror of knowing they had been vulnerable to a predator. Families who had used Riverside Memorial questioned whether their loved ones had actually been treated with the dignity Richard had promised, or whether they had been violated in ways they would never know. The Oregon Funeral Directors Association issued a statement condemning Richard's actions and emphasizing that his crimes were an aberration, not representative of an industry built on service and respect for the dead. They announced new protocols for funeral home oversight, increased inspections, and mandatory mental health screenings for professionals in death care. Richard Holloway betrayed not just his victims, but an entire profession. The statement read, "We are committed to ensuring nothing like this can happen again." Emma Moore faced the complicated task of burying her mother 29 years after her disappearance. The funeral took place on December 15, 2023, at a different funeral home, conducted by professionals who approached the service with extraordinary sensitivity. Over 100 people attended, a mixture of family, friends who remembered Patricia, community members who felt connected to her story, and strangers who simply wanted to bear witness to delayed justice. Karen Sullivan spoke at the service, her voice steady despite tears. Patricia was 35 when she was taken from us. She was a devoted mother, a loving sister, a kind person who trusted someone she should have been able to trust. For 29 years we wondered, we hoped, we imagined scenarios. Now we know. And while the truth is horrible, it's better than the not knowing. Patricia can finally rest. Emma can finally grieve properly. And all of us can find some measure of peace in knowing that the man who did this died knowing his secret was safe, But the universe had other plans. The hidden room didn't stay hidden forever. Emma had chosen to bury Patricia beside James in Pioneer Cemetery, reuniting them in death as they had planned to spend their lives together. The headstone read, Patricia Ann Moore, 1959 to 1994. Beloved wife and mother, hidden but never forgotten, finally home. During the service, Emma held photographs of her mother from before the tragedy, images of Patricia laughing, playing with Emma as a toddler, images of a woman whose life had been violently interrupted by someone she had turned to for help. The formaldehyde analysis became a landmark case in forensic chemistry. Dr. Michael Delgado, a forensic chemist who had consulted on Patricia's case, presented the findings at the American Academy of Forensic Sciences annual meeting in February 2024. His presentation detailed how chemical signatures in embalming fluid could be traced to specific manufacturers, batches, and purchase dates, creating timelines that could prove or disprove alibis and establish connections between victims and suspects. The Patricia Moore case demonstrates that chemical evidence can survive decades, Delgado explained. Even when perpetrators die, even when conventional evidence degrades, chemistry remembers. This has implications for hundreds of cold cases where preserved remains exist, but origins were never established. Several other jurisdictions contacted Salem PD requesting information about the chemical analysis techniques used in Patricia's case. 3 cold cases in other states involving bodies found in circumstances suggesting professional preservation were reopened and examined using similar methodology. One resulted in identifying a victim missing for 18 years. Another connected preserved remains to a funeral home employee who had been suspected but never charged. Patricia's case became a catalyst for solving mysteries beyond her own. The former Riverside Memorial Building was finally converted to medical offices in 2024, but not before a memorial plaque was installed near the entrance. The plaque reads, "In memory of Patricia Moore and all victims of those who abuse positions of trust, may we never forget that evil can wear the face of compassion and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still arrive." The medical practice that now occupies the building has embraced the memorial, viewing it as a reminder that healing spaces should be safe, that trust must be earned, and that vigilance against those who would exploit vulnerability is everyone's responsibility. Emma Moore established the Patricia Moore Foundation in 2024, an organization dedicated to supporting families of long-term missing persons and funding forensic science research. The foundation focuses particularly on cases where victims were targeted during periods of grief or vulnerability, working to identify patterns and prevent predators from exploiting people at their weakest moments. My mother's death was 29 years ago, but I only really lost her last year when I finally learned what happened, Emma said at the foundation's launch. For nearly 3 decades, I lived in limbo. The foundation exists to help other families find answers sooner, to fund the science that can solve impossible cases, and to honor my mother's memory by ensuring her story helps others. Detective Rivera, who led the investigation into Patricia's case, reflected on the resolution during an interview with a true crime podcast in early 2024. This case taught me that evil is patient, that predators can maintain facades for decades, and that sometimes justice comes not from brilliant detective work, but from accident and advancement in science. A construction worker swinging a sledgehammer revealed what years of investigation couldn't find. That's humbling. It reminds me that solving cold cases often requires luck, combined with preservation of evidence and willingness to apply new technologies to old mysteries. The case also prompted Oregon legislators to pass Patricia's Law in 2024, requiring increased oversight of funeral homes, unannounced inspections of preparation areas, mandatory reporting of unusual chemical purchases, and background checks for anyone working in death care. The law faced some resistance from funeral industry advocates who argued it unfairly stigmatized an honorable profession, but the legislation passed with strong public support. One predator shouldn't define an entire industry, the the bill's sponsor acknowledged, but one predator was too many, and if these regulations prevent another Richard Holloway, they're worth the additional burden. Patricia Moore's story reminds us that predators often hide in the spaces society designates for care and compassion. Hospitals, schools, churches, and funeral homes are supposed to be safe, staffed by people committed to helping others during vulnerable moments, but occasionally someone exploits that trust, uses that vulnerability as an opportunity for evil. Richard Holloway wore the mask of compassionate professional for 44 years, selecting victims carefully, hiding evidence cleverly, dying believing his secrets were safe. But nothing stays hidden forever. Hidden rooms are eventually discovered. Chemical evidence eventually speaks. And families who never stopped searching eventually find the answers they deserve, even if those answers come 29 years late and confirm the worst fears they carried throughout those decades of not knowing. Patricia Moore trusted Richard Holloway when she was at her most vulnerable, 3 days after burying her husband, alone in a funeral home with a man whose profession was death. She paid with her life for that trust. But 29 years later, a sledgehammer broke through the wall Richard had used to hide her, and formaldehyde chemistry gave Patricia a voice she had been denied. The funeral director, who believed he had achieved the ultimate preservation, instead created the evidence that exposed him. If Patricia's story has moved you, if it demonstrates the crucial importance of preserving evidence and continuing to apply new science to old cases, please subscribe to our channel. Your support enables us to continue bringing attention to cases like Patricia's, cases that might be forgotten but deserve to be told, cases where truth eventually surfaces despite every effort to bury it. Share this video with someone who appreciates how chemistry, construction accidents, and determined investigators can combine to deliver justice decades after evil believed itself safe. Leave a comment about what aspect of this case resonated with you most. Some truths are sealed behind walls, some secrets are preserved in formaldehyde. But eventually, sledgehammers break through concealment, and science reads what chemicals remember. Patricia Moore was hidden for 29 years, but she was never forgotten. And in the end, the funeral director's shrine to his own darkness became the evidence that finally told her story.